Intentionalism and dispositionalism. Um, Intentionalists believe that intentionality, the relation property of being about something, is constitutive of mentality. Brentano physicists may be the first intentionalist. Since then, there are others like Michael Tye, Tim Crane, and I count myself in that prestigious group. Brentano's physics says first that the mental is intentional and that nothing physical exhibits that property. But that creates a gap between the mental and the physical. No surprise, according to most interpreters, Brentano was the dualist. And well, as an intentionalist, I do not feel comfortable with dualism, with the postulation of something, a substance, an entity that cannot be detected by any scientific instrument, not even by the most advanced technology of neuroimaging. So I would like to save that strong intuition that intentionality is constitutive of mentality, that it is needed for a correct account and description of behavior, human or animal behavior, public representations, and artifacts of all kinds. So how to close the gap? The gap between the mental and the physical that has been opened by Brentano's thesis, especially the second part. Is pain intentional? Some say no. According to Searle, Colin McGinn, Louise Anthony, my pain is not about something or of something or for something. No? In that case, I take side with those who say yes, sensorial experience like pain are intentional. I take side with Michael Tye, Tim Crane, and Brentano himself. Pain is a topographical representation. It points to or indicates a determinate place of the body. It could be inside the body, an ailment situated in somewhere inside the body, or a superficial scratch. But there is a directedness in this pointing at, a kind of more basic kind of intentionality. Intentional notions looks very, very special. We all know Chisholm's thesis, accepted by Quine, for instance, that we cannot get outside the circle of intentional notions. Quine decided just to get away from intentional notions, but he accepted the thesis, Chisholm's thesis, that intentional notions cannot be defined in terms of other notions which are not intentional. Davidson's thesis says that the mental notions and vocabulary governed by rationality rules cannot be reduced to or redefined in terms of physical notions and vocabulary. So as we have seen, intentional notions are needed for a complete description and explanation of the world we inhabit, but they look very different from the rest. how to close the gap? I suggest, I'm not the first one, it is not very original position I'm presenting now, but dispositionalism, I believe, should be extended to include all mental properties which are also dispositional and realized physically in the brain, like the solubility of sugar, which is realized in its molecular structure. So we can be intentionalist by accepting the first part of Brentano's thesis, and dispositionalist at the same time by accepting that mental states, acts, or events have a physical base of realization. In a nutshell, the intentional is the manifestation of mental dispositions, which in turn are realized in the brain. What we call mind. 10 years ago, I wrote a paper. I present the following definition of what we call mind. A set of dispositions or powers. I'm using these two words, dispositions and powers, interchangeably. Powers to represent or feel something instantiated by a conscious and situate agent. Consciousness is itself a capacity, as we will see soon, and therefore a disposition. Well, how dispositions work? The literature on disposition is something absolutely huge today. It is almost impossible to read everything since the 90s, especially Australian philosophers have started the movement, but by now it is you can find British philosophers, Italian philosophers, United States philosophers defending the same thesis or thesis really much akin. So dispositional properties have the characteristic of two-sidedness, according to Nancy Cartwright, which means that for any such property P, there is a distinction to be made between instantiation, the instantiation of P, and its manifestation. Dispositional properties are malleable too. For instance, we can acquire an ability through repetitions, through training, and you can get better and better in what you do. If you stop training, the ability in question can decay, so to speak. P's manifestations depends on a set of auspicious circumstances. Dispositions, this is important, do not work in isolation, and they need and have a base as a component and part of it. One important point, the correct description of a disposition presupposes the truth of a counterfactual conditional. There are discussions on that topic. Not everyone accepts that, but it seems quite intuitive to suppose that when we correctly ascribe a disposition, a counterfactual conditional is true about the bearer of that property. Okay. Well, since Gilbert arrived, the concept of mind, we all know that dispositional vocabulary is quite extended. Capacity, ability, preference, taste, inclination, concepts, knowledge, taste, etc. We are dealing so with a huge vocabulary denoting mental dispositional properties. I use here the notion of repertoire introduced in the philosophy of action by Arthur Danto many years ago. Well, it is clear that we all have a certain repertoire of concepts and meanings. In score, there are many differences between difference from one person to the next. We all have our ideolect, and our meanings and concepts acquire over time relate to each other in different ways. Presupposition, logical consequence, induction, co-instantiation, incompatibility, probability, relevance, name it. If you ask me about my weekend in Pipas Beach, a beautiful beach in Rio Grande do Norte, what happens? Lots of information come to my mind in a certain order. First, the trip to the beach, the room, the installation, the hotel, the quality of the food, of the service, people. The people there were nice or not, the beach, the weather, and so on. The relevance may vary according to the topic and the circumstances. Not all the concepts are activated to the same degree. Here I have an illustration. For instance, what I will tell you about my weekend in Pipas Beach could be could activate concepts at the top of the pyramids, you know. What is below the line is less relevant, and the degree of activation is much lesser. So it's an hypothesis, but I think what we mean by holism in the philosophy of mind lead us to such an hypothesis. We can use different representation, the vectorial representation. For instance, in my ideolect, the meaning associated with to cut or cutting would be stronger in the case of a knife, because when I cut something, or when I find myself in a situation where someone cut something, usually it is with a knife. So the tendency to activate the idea of cutting something with a knife is stronger than cutting something with an axe or bisturi or laser and so on.
André, sorry,
yeah,
5 minutes.
5 minutes, we will be able to do that. Okay. The case for propositional attitudes. In the case of the psychological mind, in the case of propositional attitudes that we ascribe to people in order to explain, illuminate, understand the behavior, belief, desires, intention can have a long duration. Normally, a belief that 2 plus 2 is 4 is long life lasting. Once we have learned, it's stay with us, so to speak. And we can attribute to someone deeply asleep the belief that 2 plus 2 is 4. Some desires disappear quickly, others not. Intention lasts as long as the corresponding plan is carried out. I use plan here in the Michael Bratman's sense. A plan is a general intention that determines a hierarchy of subordinated intentions. If I plan to travel in China next year, I cannot consciously think about that all the time. The rest of the time, my intention is on standby, so to speak. The plan is reactivated when auspicious circumstances appear. In other words, the disposition or the plan manifests itself in these circumstances. Prima facie, the case for phenomenal properties could be a bit more complicated, but recently, philosophers like Lynn Rudder-Baker and Simone Gozzano advanced thesis exactly in that direction. Phenomenal properties also can be conceived of as dispositional. I quote Lynn Baker in her last book, Naturalism in the First Person Perspective. A person is a conscious being even when she is asleep and is not manifesting consciousness. A language using person is a self-conscious being even when she is perceiving herself and is not manifesting self-consciousness. And Simone Gozzano, in a very interesting paper with quite complicated dialectic, published 2 years ago in Topoi, says, I shall argue that phenomenal properties are dispositions with an essential manifestation, a characteristic feeling. So they are at least a tendency recently appear in analytic philosophy to consider even phenomenal properties as dispositional too. And finally, well, those who know me a bit know that I like the big picture. I like to be able to situate myself in a philosophical map, so to speak. So the big picture to which we are pointing is the following. If all mental properties are dispositional, the prospect for a physicalist and monist view of the properties are pretty good. The two-sidedness of mental dispositions means that they can be considered as something physical. They are realized in the brain, in brain structures, and as something intentional as well, their manifestation being characterized by directedness. By our physical constitutions, we belong to the natural world. By the manifestation of our dispositions, capacity, abilities, competence, etc., we are in a position to create a world of artifacts. So dispositionalism could be a way to close Brentano's gap. Thank you very much.
Thank you, André. Now we have time for questions. Matthias?
Just one question. You started your talk talking about the gap, and you can situate the gap at different levels. You can talk about an ontological gap, like a dualism of substances, or you can talk about a gap at the epistemological level. I mean, I guess that Davidson closes the gap at the ontological level, but it still remains a strong epistemological gap in the sense that you cannot have strict psychophysical laws. By that, Davidson means laws that have no ceteris paribus clauses and allows you to make very precise predictions. And that gap seems quite difficult to close. Because Davidson admits that you can have laws that are of a different kind, that not allow you to make like very precise predictions that have ceteris paribus clauses. But I mean, do you want to close the gap in that way, that strong way, that epistemological gap? It seems that that gap remains, it's very difficult to close.
No, when I think about the gap, I think of it as in ontological terms.
Yeah.
So I can agree with Davidson that we are material beings, but it is clear that we live in a world of artifacts that we have created. Just look around. You have a lot of such artifacts, house, computers, and institutions. What I'm saying is that you cannot explain everything just by using the vocabulary of the theories of natural sciences. That's a limitation. So you cannot explain in physicalist terms why the actions of ethanol in stock market are so and so. You cannot do that in physicalist terms. So we need both vocabulary. But as long as we consider alternatives to dualism, for instance, I believe that dispositionalism has something to offer. There is a path to be followed here, and we are just at the beginning. So epistemological gap, no, I have no ambition for now. I believe there is no way to close the gap at that level, but ontologically, dispositionalism has something to offer. Yeah.
We have one more question from Felipe Nogueira.
So thank you for the presentation. I'll turn up my microphone here, see if it gets better. So some have said that sentiments, say, as a general and fairly stable attitudes and preferences held by a person, are dispositional, in the sense that, say, to love classical music just is to be disposed to appreciate and enjoy classical music when one hears it. And so I'm thinking about an argument by Robert Solomon when he argued that sentiments cannot be dispositions because it doesn't capture certain facts about sentiments. So he gives the example of a man who hates his oppressive father. And Solomon says that he is not just disposed to feel hate in certain occasions, Like he truly hates his father all the time since childhood. You know, this is something that structures many of his actions and life choices, not only when he's actively feeling hate. So my question is, do you agree? Do you think this points to sort of a limit of the dispositional analysis of mental states, or you do still try to analyze sentiments in dispositional terms?
I would try to analyze in dispositionalist terms. I do not know the analysis you are mentioning. Could you repeat the name of the author?
It's Robert Solomon.
Robert Solomon. Okay, I would go after that, after this analysis. But sentiment look pretty much to me like disposition, ways to react in some circumstances, like any other mental disposition. They are triggered by auspicious, appropriate circumstances. And well, I didn't hear quite clearly your the point you are making.
Yes. So just to try to clarify, he says that when say a man who hates his oppressive father, so he's just not disposed to feel hate on certain occasions. Like he hates him all the time. He structures his actions, his life choices. So if you just say that sentiments are dispositions to feel certain things at certain times, you don't capture the sense how this sentiment structures his entire life. You know, not only at the times that he's feeling it. So that's basically the argument.
Well, I do not see why long lasting negative sentiment could not be a disposition.
I'm sorry. We have one more question for, if I don't know if can answer it too, just for more persons to make questions too. We have in fact, we have lots of questions in the chat, but we may have more time for one. Mariana Browings. She wrote, do you think that an ecological approach to dispositions can help fill the gap?
I have to think twice to answer the question. As I know Mariana very well, we are regularly in contact. I will think of it, and later I can discuss with you that question. For now, I don't have. Yeah, it's okay. Okay, I don't have a readily answer to the question.
Okay, thanks, André.
Sorry. Obrigado.